Scope management. It's very, very important in any project, any program. Before you deliver, you need to know what is the scope, what exactly we are supposed to do as part of this project. So planning for, having the clear cut scope is absolutely important, and we know it's not easy to make a finalized scope immediately, because there will be so many moving parts. You don't know whether this particular point is part of the scope or this particular is part of out of scope, etc. So defining the scope very clearly is absolutely important. So you have to plan for it, like when you will have the discussions to with all the stakeholders involved, to make sure that you gather all the requirements, and when do you close it, and how will you have a revalidation of the finalized scope that you think is correct, and then validate and ensure that there is no change to it, etc. So first and foremost thing is you have to plan for the scope management. And the second thing is, obviously, you collect the requirements as to what all the requirements that we have to meet as part of this project. So what you do is you probably have multiple meetings with different stakeholders involved. You ask them, you discuss with them, okay, this is what we need, these are the business objectives that we need to meet, is what the business is going to tell you. And then you require, then you list down probably all the use cases, all the requirements, everything in probably documentation. And you will have multiple discussions with them to iterate it through to make sure that all the requirements are captured. So not necessarily it becomes one or two iterations only. It could go to multiple iterations also, where you capture the requirements, you refine it, and you have a discussion, and you figure out, okay, there is one more thing which is missing, you may probably add. So collecting these requirements, documenting it, and presenting it back to the customer, and then seeing that, okay, this is what means that we have collected all the requirements which will form the basis for the scope. And it's also possible that even after you do everything, there is a possibility that the solution that you are coming up with to meet those requirements may need some alterations, because some things may not be feasible, some things may be feasible, and something you might have to do slightly differently than what customer is asking for. So what you do is sometimes you create the prototypes and show it to the client, or you discuss with them and make them visualize what you are solutionizing, and there could be slightly difference in what the customer is expecting versus how you are suggesting a solution to be. So making sure that at very high level, these are the requirements, this is how the solution is going to be at very high level, prototype level, and making them understand that, okay, these are the customer needs and how we are going to implement, and this is part of the scope that we are going to deliver, is absolutely essential. And absolutely essential part is also that you clearly call out what is not part of the scope or out of scope, because unless some things are explicitly mentioned, it probably is assumed that this will be part of the scope, and the moment you call out certain things as it's out of scope, then it becomes explicitly clear that, okay, this is not going to be part of the delivery of this particular project. So collecting requirements, defining this scope, make sure that, okay, you are at least to a large extent, you are very clear on the requirement or the scope of that particular project. Now comes the next part, and it's a absolutely very important part, which is creating the work breakdown structure. What is work breakdown structure? So your project may be slightly not slightly, maybe a bigger project where you need to break it down into a smaller set of pieces where you can independently deliver it and you can track it, and which is also having a deliverable associated with it. So you could have a work breakdown structure for that particular project. This is number 1 component, number 2 component, and number 3 component. Likewise, there are 10 different components which will have its own set of life cycle, people, and delivery, and there is a deliverable associated with it. So you clearly segregate into, okay, these are my 10 different work streams which will work together to make this project happen, and this is the work breakdown structure. So just to give one example of a particular IT project, it could be an implementation project. Let's say you could have set of documents to be delivered as high level design documents, and that could be in different areas of, if you are implementing an ERP, for example, you could have a finance as an area, or supply chain as an area, or human resources as an area. So each of them will become one particular work work stream: finance work stream, supply chain work stream, human resources work stream, like that. Or if it is a development project where you have multiple software development components to be developed, so what will happen is you will have corresponding development components breakdown structure. So for example, there may be integration technical components that you will have to develop, or there may be reporting development components that you have to develop, or it could be data migration from, let's say, a legacy system to a target system that has to be done, or you'll have to develop some customizations to the product that you are trying to use as a solution for the platform, and things like that. So here, integration, data migration, reporting, customization, these are all going to be 4 different work streams. People could be different for working on those work streams, and also the deliverable that's coming out of that work streams will be a different one. So likewise, for each of the work streams, you will have its own set of actions, responsibilities, as well as activities. So that defines very clearly, this is my project scope, these are the work breakdown structures that I am going to have, and in each of these, am I clear with the scope? So in this particular case, integration is a work stream. Do I know how many integrations I have to develop? Do I know all the requirements for it? Do I know what are the source and target systems which are going to be integrated? Do I know who are the stakeholders involved in these particular things, etc.? You may not need to know all the details of the particular component. However, you need to be at least clear as to, okay, in this work breakdown structure, these are the work streams involved, and in each of the work streams, do I know clearly what is the scope of my delivery? So if at all, if you are able to answer that, then it becomes a good comprehensive scope defined for that project. And obviously, once you are done with this structure of creating a work breakdown structure, you can validate this scope with the stakeholders. An important part is you need to have a clear-cut stakeholders, okay? Because unless you have proper stakeholders involved, tomorrow when you are moving further to the stage of development completion, testing, and towards implementation, someone else altogether all out of a blue may come and, okay, this was my requirement and nobody did it, or nobody has taken care of this requirement. That should not happen. So you should make sure that all the stakeholders are initially identified in the project kickoff stage itself, and make sure that their inputs are taken care into the scope, as well as when you're taking the sign off of that scope, you ensure that all the stakeholders give sign off, so that your scope is tightly controlled. So because the moment you freeze the scope, it becomes very good for the subsequent stages of the project to go forward, work on it, and deliver it. The moment things keep changing, everybody is unclear as to what needs to be done, what should not be done. So that should not happen, and it is very common, as everybody sees in the regular, it's life after all, right? So there will be changes coming in, and there will always be an opportunity for improvement. So scope change is inevitable part of life. However, how well we control that scope change becomes very important for the subject of for the success of the project. Because what would usually happens is, scope creep is a very common phenomena in all the projects. Unless we tightly control or have a mechanism to control it, it goes out of hand and project is likely to be failure. So you should define saying that, okay, this is the scope change management process. So this will go through so and so steps. It has to go through a series of reviews, series of approvals. There could be an authority to review these changes and then only approve, because any such additions to the scope or changes to the scope comes with its own liabilities, or it will impact financially. It would require additional resources, might be. It would possibly impact the schedule or the quality. So the moment you change the scope, there is possibility to impact schedule, scope, budget, and quality. So there is a chance that it could impact. So you have to tightly control. And it is not to say that you are not going to be flexible at all to implement any scope changes, because sometimes when you are very much close to the project implementation, a small change is required which is essential. Everybody missed out for whatever reason, but without which the implementation will not be successful. In that case, you obviously need to incorporate and add those additional elements to the scope. Unless you do that, it won't be successful. So such changes with flexibility is required at that particular time. However, we need to be cognizant that what can make or break with the scope changes. So we have to make sure that we tightly control them. So that's about the overall scope changes. You have to plan the scope, you have to collect the requirements, you have to define the scope, you have to create a work breakdown structure, you have to validate the scope, and also you have to control the scope so that it doesn't become a big scope creep and impacts the overall project success. So you need to make sure that all the people are involved. You communicate the scope very effectively to all the stakeholders involved who actually are going to deliver that scope, as well as who have provided the inputs to form the scope, so that everybody comes to the same page and work towards a common goal of meeting the business objectives. And while communicating also, if at all, if we are able to communicate as to why we are doing what we are doing, it becomes even more impactful as to why this particular thing is in the project scope, and what we need to ensure to make sure that this is implemented or worked upon. And there could be various ways in which the scope can be defined, not necessarily in a similar way, because if it is, let's say, application maintenance and support kind of a project, right? So here the scope of services could be altogether different way defined than a development project, for example. So scope of services could include what are the applications you are going to support, what kind of ticket volumes you are going to support in a month, how much you are going to resolve, what kind of scope you have to manage the high priority support tickets that are coming your way, or what is the SLA mechanism that you will going to have. This all forms the scope of an application maintenance and services project, and there's more. So the point here is the kind of scope that you're going to write down and deliver it for an AMS project will be slightly different than the development project. And let's say you are not in an IT industry, and could be altogether a different industry altogether, and it may be a manufacturing, for example. The scope that you are going to define for developing one particular product or something could be altogether in a different way. But the concepts of how do you define the scope remains the same. You plan the scope, you collect the requirements from the stakeholders involved, you define it, and then you create a work breakdown structure involved with that scope understanding. You validate it with the stakeholders, and then you try to control that scope as much as possible so that it doesn't become a scope creep. So hope that was useful. That is mainly about how do you manage the scope. But do note that there will be changes coming in, and when you are in the middle of heart of the things, there is so many things that everybody asks for. So many emails will go around, many people shout, many people might absolutely ask for this essential, how can this not be, and things like that. Those are the practical scenarios which would come in eventually when we are in the middle of the project. But keeping a calm mind at that particular time, do I need to do it? Is it part of the scope? So going back to that basics will help. And it's at the other extreme, it should not also be the stubborn case that no, this is not part of my scope, so that's why it's not going to be delivered. So a little bit of flexibility is also expected as much as possible to understand empathetically from the customer's point of view, why is he asking for what he's asking, right? So that kind of scope management is what is required on the ground, even after you define the scope and freeze it. Not necessarily that it will be carved in stone all the time. So there will be a version change to that scope, and possibly you might get additional budget or time or other constraints that you might have because of those changes. But eventually, the goal is not to fixate to the scope that you have originally defined, but to meet the overall business objectives and expectations of the end customer. So, with that in mind, if you approach the scope management, and I feel that you will be able to manage it well. Hopefully, that was useful. Thank you.